The wagon wheel gave its last honest turn a half-mile from the gate, and Thomas Bellamy felt it go soft beneath him like a tooth working loose. He did not curse. He glanced at his daughter beside him on the bench, then eased the tired horse down to a walk. Ruth sat up straighter, watching the road ahead as if the answer might cost her something. "Are we stopping?" He kept his eyes on the horse's ears. "We're arriving. Different thing." Ahead, past bare cottonwoods, smoke rose straight up from a ranch house chimney into a gray sky. Snow lay thin in the wagon ruts, and snow covered the mountains well below their ridge lines. A woman was in the yard, not waiting for company, but bent over a fence post with a maul, checking it for plumb. She heard the wagon and straightened as they approached. Thomas set the brake, climbed down on legs stiff from 3 weeks of road, and took off his hat. "Afternoon. Name's Thomas Bellamy. This is my daughter, Ruth." The woman set the maul against the post. "Sarah Kessler. This is my land." He nodded toward the mountains behind her. "We're bound for my late wife's parents, past Bitterroot Junction. Our town emptied out after the freight depot closed. Ruth took sick on the road, and a bridge washed out east of here, and the miles got away from us before the snow did." He kept his voice even, a man reporting facts rather than asking for pity. "I'm not asking charity. I'm asking if you've got winter work for a man who knows freight and harness." She glanced toward the wagon. "What else do you know?" He counted the work on his fingers. Wagons, sleds, feed storage, general repair, 2 winters running supply through these passes before Ruth was born. Her eyes went to Ruth, sitting very still on the bench, hands folded, a canvas bundle held against her side like something she wasn't sure she'd be allowed to keep. "When did she eat last?" He hesitated half a second too long. "Yesterday noon." She started toward the house. "Bring her in. We'll talk work after she's had supper." He followed her 1 step. "I can pay for what she eats." She didn't slow her stride. "You can pay for it by fixing that fence post tomorrow. Tonight she eats because she's hungry. That's reason enough." Ruth looked at her father. He nodded once, and she climbed down and followed Sarah toward the light in the windows without being told twice. The house smelled of wood smoke and beans. Ruth sat very straight at the table, hands in her lap, until Sarah set a full bowl in front of her without asking whether she wanted it, and only then did the girl pick up her spoon. She ate slowly at first, watching Sarah as if speed might be noticed and judged, then faster once it seemed no one was counting. Halfway through the second bowl she stopped and wrapped a biscuit in her napkin, tucking it into the canvas bundle at her feet. Sarah saw it and said nothing, only refilled the girl's cup with milk before she had to ask. She lowered the jug. "For tonight you'll sleep in the loft. If your father stays on, I'll clear the small room off the kitchen." Ruth's spoon stopped halfway to her mouth. "How long is longer?" She didn't look up from the stove. "However long the snow says it is. I don't control the weather. Wish I did. I'd have opinions about it." That got the smallest twitch of a smile out of the girl. Outside, an older ranch hand named Otis Dell examined the horse's foreleg while Thomas watched. Otis released the leg. "Strain, not a break. Rest'll see to it." He straightened, wiping his palm on his trousers. "Thank her, not me. She's short-handed this winter. Me and a boy of 17 named Charlie, willing enough but green as spring grass. You showing up's relief to her, if you're worth your salt." Thomas returned his attention to the horse. "I intend to be." Otis grunted and turned back toward the barn without looking around. "We'll see." Sarah hired him the next morning, arms crossed, while he looked over a hay barn roof patched wrong twice already. $12 a month. Meals, the small room off the kitchen. When the road's clear, you go. No debt owed either direction. He glanced toward the room Ruth would use. That's fair. Sarah's tone stayed flat. I didn't ask if it was fair. I told you what it is. She turned toward the barn, then paused at the gate. Your girl. Does she ride? He shook his head slightly. A little. She was already turning toward the barn. She'll learn better here. Thomas mended tack and patched the roof, and within the week braced the failing wagon wheel enough to see it through winter storage, leaving the full rebuild for spring. Ruth was given the hens to gather, a task Sarah handed her as a plain need rather than a kindness, and within 2 weeks she handled the hens without being reminded. The riding lesson came on a still, cold morning in November. Sarah led the gray mare out on a rope and set Ruth up in the saddle herself, adjusting the stirrup short. She rested one hand on the mare's neck. Keep your hands soft. She already knows how to walk. Your job's not to argue with her. Ruth held the reins like they might bite her. When the mare shifted its weight and took 2 quick sideways steps at a barn cat crossing its path, the girl went rigid and hauled back hard on the reins, and the mare, confused by the mixed signal, tossed its head and sidestepped again. Her breath caught. I can't. Sarah stood at the mare's shoulder, one palm steady on the bridle, her voice even. You can. You're pulling like you're fighting her. She's not fighting you. She waited a beat, watching the girl's grip. Ease off. Just an inch. Let her feel you trust her a little. Ruth's knuckles were white, but she loosened her hold, barely. The mare settled, blew out a breath, and stood still. Sarah stepped back. There. That's all it took. Ruth sat a moment, startled by her own success, her shoulders coming down from around her ears. From the barn doorway, Thomas had stopped with a coil of rope in his hands, and he let it play out without calling her name, watching Sarah let Ruth complete a slow circle on her own. Sarah passed him at the barn door afterward. She did that herself. I only kept the horse from being an idiot about it. He fell into step beside her. Looked to me like more than that. She was almost smiling. Then you weren't looking close enough. The feed cache failed him a week later. An early hard freeze locked the ground overnight, and he found the cache he'd built near the north fence, ground that had seemed sensible before the snow, behind a drift 3 feet deep. He pressed one boot into the snow. I misjudged the wind. Sarah studied the drift line. The ravine drives the winter wind straight across that ground. You've only been here a few weeks, and I should have warned you. We'll move the cache to the lee side of the equipment shed. They rebuilt it together over 2 cold days, hauling sacks through crusted snow until neither of them could feel their fingers. One dawn, Sarah tasted his coffee and lowered the cup with a look of genuine betrayal. This is an insult to freight men everywhere. He lifted the pot in his own defense. 11 years in freight camps and not one complaint. She drank the whole cup anyway, making a face the entire time. One evening, hauling grain sacks toward the equipment shed, they argued about where to stack them. Sarah wanted the south wall, away from a roof that had leaked before. Thomas eyed the shorter path to the north. Sarah hefted a sack onto her shoulder. It's closer, but that roof cost me a winter's oats already. I'm not losing another to save myself a few steps. Thomas shifted the sack on his own shoulder. Fair enough. South it is. I'll get up on that roof come spring. She gave him a sideways look. I'll hold you to that. She laughed, short and real, and hauled the next sack up before he could take it from her. They finished the last of it after the other hands had gone in, alone in the lamp-lit shed with snow ticking soft against the roof. Sarah pulled off her gloves and found the split seam neatly restitched, though she hadn't asked him to fix them. She turned the glove over. "You didn't have to do that." He latched the shed door and held the lantern up for the walk back. "Didn't take but a minute. Seemed a shame to let good gloves go to waste over a little thread." She fell into step beside him, closer than the path required, and neither one moved to close the gap or widen it. A letter came in mid-December, carried by a freight driver on his last run before the pass shut. Ruth traced her grandmother's handwriting with one finger before folding it into the tin box where she kept her mother's letters too. Sarah glanced up from her mending. Once Ruth had gone up to bed. "They sound kind." He set the letter on the table. "They are. I made my wife a promise near the end that Ruth would know her mother's people." She folded the letter along its worn crease. "That's a promise worth keeping." Then she rose and added wood to the stove. After that, no wagon bells sounded beyond the gate. The pass had shut under drifts higher than a man's head. On a slow evening in January, Ruth sat at the kitchen table with a scrap of ribbon that had belonged to her mother, torn along one edge, and a needle she didn't quite know how to use. Sarah sat across from her and showed her the stitch without taking the needle from her hand. Ruth kept her eyes on her work. "I already forget things about Mama. I don't remember her voice right anymore." Sarah's hands kept moving. "Then we write down what you do remember before it goes further. One thing tonight, another tomorrow, and you ask your father for a story about her once a week. Make him tell it proper." Ruth tested the mended seam with her thumb. "Will that work?" Sarah handed the ribbon back. "I don't know for certain, but it beats losing it and never trying. And when you get to your grandmother's, ask her the same. She'll have pieces of your mother you never got to see." Ruth turned the ribbon over in her hands, her shoulders loosening, and began quietly to tell Sarah about the sound her mother used to make when she was cross about a spoiled batch of bread. By the time the ribbon was finished, the boots that had once stood beside Ruth's bed each night were back in the closet. That same week, Alma Pruitt arrived at the gate with a wagon load of belongings and a chimney too cracked to trust through the cold months. She and Sarah had traded shelter and help through hard winters going back a decade, and Sarah put her up in the spare room without much discussion. A hard blow came through in late January, a week before the worst storm of the winter. Snow piled against the north side of the barn until the door wouldn't swing, and half the cattle they'd meant to keep in the near pasture had drifted, spooked by the wind, toward a stand of trees a mile off, ground Thomas hadn't marked, not knowing cattle favored it in weather like this. Sarah was saddling up when he found her. "They go there every hard blow. Should have told you back in November." He reached for his own saddle. "Then we mark it today, so neither of us forgets again." They brought the herd back before dark, cold-handed and short-tempered. Thomas's coat crusted white to the shoulders by the time the last steer balked at the gate and had to be driven through by hand. That night, Thomas drove a line of stakes out to the tree stand by lantern light, Sarah walking behind him, correcting the line once where his sense of the ground was wrong and hers was right. She caught his arm before he could plant the stake. "Further west. Ground drops there. You'd have a man walking a route that puts him ankle-deep in a wash he can't see coming." He moved the stake without argument, and by the time they were done, the line ran true enough that a stranger to the ranch could have followed it blind. The real storm came a week later. 3 days of wind that erased the world past the porch rail. On the second morning, Otis and Charlie failed to return from bringing the last of the cattle down from the upper pasture. Sarah stood in the yard in the gray half-light, her composure cracking just enough to show the fear beneath it. "They should have been back an hour ago." Thomas pulled his coat on. "The route we marked runs past the second creek crossing. If they're caught out, they'll make for the line shack." She reached for her own coat. "You can't search that ground alone in this." He looked at her, steady. "Not alone. I know the winter gear, you know the ground. We go together, or we don't find them in time." Sarah crouched to Ruth's level at the kitchen doorway, Alma pulling a shawl tight behind them. "You mind Mrs. Pruitt same as you'd mind me. Keep the stove fed, keep the door latched, don't go past the porch rail." Ruth squared her shoulders. "I remember." Alma set a hand on the girl's shoulder. "She'll do fine. Go on, and find your men." They found Otis and Charlie 2 hours later, holed up at the shack, half frozen but alive by the stove Thomas had stocked in December. Charlie had struck his forearm against a rock when his spooked horse went down. Sarah examined the swelling until his face went gray. She kept his wrist still. "Feels broken. He can't ride." Thomas pulled a length of kindling from the wood box and split it for a splint. The stovepipe had choked with snow from a wind shift no one could have planned for, the fire guttering low. Sarah looked toward the loft ladder. "There's an old sledge above us. Caleb started new runners on it before he died and never finished them. It'll hold Charlie if we lash it right." They worked fast in bad light, Thomas splicing the cracked runner with harness leather and wire, Sarah rigging a harness from what rope they had. By the time Charlie's forearm was splinted and secured against his chest, the wind had risen enough to erase the marked route entirely. Sarah walked ahead on foot the whole way back, reading the land where the buried stake line ran. At the creek, the ice groaned the moment the sledge runners touched the bank. She threw up an arm to stop them. "Not there. Currents undercut it." She moved along the bank, testing each step with her boot heel before trusting her weight to it, until she found a stretch that held. "Here. Bring them straight across. Slow." Thomas kept the team tight, easing the sledge forward a foot at a time while Otis walked the upstream side. One hand braced against the rail to keep it from sliding on the angle. Halfway across, a runner caught on a hidden ridge of ice, and the sledge lurched sideways. Thomas hauled the lead horse's head back around before it could bolt, and the sledge settled straight again. The ice held under Charlie's weight, then cracked in a long seam behind them the moment the runners cleared the far bank. Charlie had gone quiet somewhere in the crossing, his eyes half shut, and Thomas called Charlie's name twice, sharp, until the boy's eyes opened again and stayed open. They came through the gate near full dark. Otis stumbled beside the sledge, too numb and exhausted to complain. Ruth met them at the door with blankets already warmed by the stove and a kettle of water heating, Alma close behind her. Thomas checked his daughter over before he took off his own coat. Alma took the kettle from Ruth's hands to pour it herself. "She kept that stove going the whole time." Sarah stood in the kitchen afterward, coat dripping snowmelt on the floor, watching Thomas kneel by Charlie's bed to check the splint once more. She kept her eyes on him as he worked. "You'd have found the shack without me." He crossed the kitchen and took the wet coat from her shoulders. "I'd have found the shack. You found the crossing when the stakes were gone." He hung the coat beside his own. Her hand still trembled when she reached for the coffee pot, and the cup rattled against the saucer. He steadied it, his fingers closing briefly over hers, and she let them stay a moment before she drew back and poured. The thaw came slow, brown mud along the south fences first, then the creek running loud by late March. Thomas pulled the wagon wheel out of storage and rebuilt it properly this time. New spokes, fresh grease, the canvas patched where winter had worn it thin. Ruth packed her small bundle again, the same one she'd once unpacked, into the dresser drawer, and Sarah helped her fold clothes into it, mending the girl's travel coat at the elbow and tucking a small paper packet of seeds into the corner of the bundle. Ruth turned the packet over in her hands. "What's this for?" Sarah tucked it deeper into the bundle. "Your grandmother's garden. Every garden wants something new in the spring." Thomas paused in the doorway one evening, watching her fold Ruth's things with the same steady hands that had rigged a sledge harness in a storm. "You've packed that twice now." She kept her eyes on the coat she was mending. Her grandmother shouldn't meet her with half a winter's mess in her trunk. He watched a moment, then returned to his own work. Later that week, Sarah stood at the kitchen window looking toward the north barn. "Once the ground firms up, that roof wants resetting before next winter, and the feed platform ought to move farther east." The words had come as naturally as though Thomas would still be there to help with both. She went back to her mending without finishing the thought. He found her by the wagon 2 days later, checking the wheel he'd already checked twice himself. He ran his palm over the rebuilt wheel. "Would there be work here when we come back?" She wiped grease from her fingers onto her apron without looking up. "There's always work here." He left the wrench on the hub and faced her fully. "That all there'd be?" She set down the rag she'd been holding and held his gaze. "No, I don't expect it would be." He stepped away from the wheel. "Then I'll say it plain. I want Ruth's grandmother to meet you, and I want you beside us on the road there, and beside us on the road back. I want to marry you, Sarah." She put her hand in his. "I will." They told Ruth together that evening. The girl looked between them, then asked whether Sarah was coming to Bitterroot Junction too. When Sarah said she was, Ruth went to the wagon and moved her bundle over to make room for another, and asked whether her grandmother would know to expect 3 of them instead of 2. Thomas looked toward the road. "We'll ride as soon as the pass opens." In the days before the wedding, Thomas widened the wagon seat by a hand's width, working the boards loose and resetting them so 3 could sit abreast instead of 2. Sarah packed a small trunk of her own, folding it in beside Ruth's bundle without needing to ask where it should go. "What is she like?" Sarah asked, nodding toward the tin box of letters. "Your grandmother." Ruth considered this seriously. "Flower seeds. Mama used to say she never met a bare patch of dirt she liked." Sarah added a second paper packet to the trunk without another word. Thomas found her checking the wagon's new seat that evening, testing the width with her hand. He sat down beside her to prove it held. "Plenty of room," he said. "Should be. The trouble you went to." "Wasn't trouble." He handed her the strap she'd been reaching for before she could ask. "Feels different, packing for a road that comes back around." "It does." She took the strap, her fingers brushing his, and didn't hurry to let go. They married on the porch in May, Ruth's wildflowers on the rail, Otis standing witness. 2 weeks later, the wagon rolled toward Bitterroot Junction with the packet of seeds tucked inside Ruth's bundle. Behind them, their fresh wheel tracks led back to the ranch gate.